The year was 1944, and somewhere along a muddy road in the French countryside, a motorcycle cut through the fog carrying a rider whose face was hidden beneath goggles and a helmet and whose leather satchel contained documents that could determine the fate of an entire bombing campaign, and the rider was not a man as the German patrols assumed, but a woman, and not just any woman, but a black woman from Alabama, who had grown up picking cotton under a sun that burned without mercy, and who now carried the secrets of the United States Army Air Forces across enemy territory because she had refused to accept that her life would be defined by the limitations others tried to place upon her. Her name was Elisa May Thornton, and she had been born in 1921 in a small town outside of Tuskegee, where the red clay earth stained everything it touched and where black families worked land that had once held their ancestors in chains. And Eliza grew up watching her father break his back in fields that would never belong to him, and she swore to herself that she would find another way to live. And when the war came, she saw her chance, not as an escape from hardship, but as an opportunity to prove that black women could serve their country with the same courage and dedication as anyone else. The Women's Army Corps had begun accepting black women in 1942, and Eliza was among the first to volunteer from her county, and she endured the skeptical looks of the recruiting officers and the whispered doubts of those who believed that women like her belonged in kitchens and laundries rather than in uniform, and she said nothing to their faces. But inside she carried a fire that would not be extinguished, and that fire would carry her across an ocean to a war that would test everything she believed about herself and her country. She trained at Fort Des Moines in Iowa, where black WACs were housed in segregated barracks and given assignments that white women refused, and Eliza learned to type and file and answer telephones, but she also learned to ride motorcycles because the motor pool needed drivers, and no one else wanted to navigate the icy roads in winter, and she discovered that she had a gift for machines and for speed, and for remaining calm when everything around her was chaos, and her commanding officers began to notice that this quiet woman from Alabama never complained and never failed to complete her missions. But what happened next changed everything, because in the spring of 1944, Eliza was transferred to England as part of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-black WAC unit to serve overseas during the war. And while her official assignment was sorting, Milshev was secretly recruited for a different purpose entirely, and she was told that the Army needed couriers who could transport classified documents between bases without attracting attention, and a black woman on a motorcycle was invisible to the enemy because they could not imagine that America would trust someone like her with anything important. The irony was not lost on Elisa that the same racism that oppressed her at home now protected her in war, and she accepted the assignment without hesitation because she understood that sometimes you had to use the weapons your enemies gave you, and her invisibility became her greatest asset. And she memorized routes and recognition codes and dead-drop locations. And she learned to read maps in darkness and to navigate by stars when the fog was too thick for headlights, and she became one of the most reliable couriers in the European theater, though her name would never appear in any official history. The documents she carried included bombing coordinates and intelligence reports and orders that would send hundreds of young men into the skies over Germany, and she never opened the sealed pouches because she did not need to know what was inside, and she only needed to know that the information had to reach its destination and that failure was not an option. And she rode through rain that soaked through her uniform and cold that numbed her fingers on the handlebars, and heat that made the leather seat burn through her pants, and she never stopped, because stopping meant that someone might die. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because on a September morning in she was given a package that was different from all the others, and her commanding officer looked at her with eyes that held both trust and fear and told her that this delivery could not fail under any circumstances, and that she was to avoid all contact with other personnel, and that if she was captured she was to destroy the documents immediately, even if it meant her own death. And Eliza took the package and asked no questions, because questions were a luxury that couriers could not afford. The route took her from a base in southern England across the Channel to France, where the Allied forces had established a foothold after D-Day, and the roads were cratered and dangerous and filled with convoys and refugees and the scattered remnants of German units that had been cut off from retreat. And Elisa rode alone because traveling in groups attracted attention, and she kept her head down and her throttle open, and she passed through checkpoints where tired soldiers waved her through without a second glance, because she was just another messenger. And messengers were everywhere in those chaotic days. And then something no one expected, because as she approached a small village near the front lines, her motorcycle began to sputter, and she realized that she was running low on fuel and the nearest depot was miles away, and she would never make it, and she had to make a decision that could cost her the mission or her life, and she chose to push the motorcycle off the road and hide it in a barn and continue on foot, carrying the satchel against her chest like a child she was protecting from the cold. The forest she entered was dense with shadows, and the sound of artillery rumbled in the distance like thunder from a storm that never ended, and Eliza moved through the trees with a silence. She had learned from hunting rabbits with her father as a girl, and she listened for the snap of twigs and the rustle of undergrowth that would signal the presence of German patrols. And she heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart and the whisper of wind through branches that had already begun to turn gold with autumn. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because she came upon a destroyed farmhouse where the walls had collapsed inward and the roof had burned away, leaving only blackened timbers reaching toward the sky, and she thought the building was empty until she heard a sound that made her freeze. And it was the sound of a child crying softly in the darkness beneath the rubble. And Eliza knew that she should keep moving because the mission was everything. But she could not leave a child alone in this wasteland, and she made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She found the girl beneath a fallen beam in what had once been a root cellar, and she was perhaps 7 years old, with dark hair, matted with dust, and eyes that held the blank stare of someone who had seen too much death. And Elisa did not speak French, but she spoke the universal language of comfort. And she held the child against her chest and rocked her gently and whispered that everything would be all right, even though she knew it was a lie, because nothing in this war was all right and nothing ever would be again. The girl's name was Marie, and her family had been killed 2 days earlier when the Germans shelled the farmhouse during their retreat, and she had survived by hiding in the cellar and drinking water that dripped through the stones and eating raw potatoes that her mother had stored for winter. And Eliza looked at this child and saw every black child in Alabama who had been left orphaned by violence and poverty, and she made a decision that went against every order she had been given, and she took Marie with her because some things are more important than war. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because as she carried Marie through the forest, she stumbled upon a German patrol that had stopped to rest in a clearing, and there were 6 soldiers sitting around a small fire eating rations, and their rifles were stacked nearby. Elisa dropped to the ground and covered Marie's mouth with her hand and prayed that the child would not make a sound, and they lay there in the wet leaves for what felt like hours, while the Germans laughed and talked in a language Eliza did not understand. The patrol finally moved on, and Eliza waited until their voices faded completely before she rose from the ground, and she realized that her detour had cost her precious time, and that she was now behind schedule, and that the information she carried might arrive too late to matter. And she began to run through the forest with Marie clinging to her back and the satchel bouncing against her hip and her lungs burning with exertion. But she did not stop, because she could not stop, because too many lives depended on her reaching her destination. She emerged from the forest as the sun was setting, and she could see the American encampment spread across the valley below her with its rows of tents and vehicles, and the constant movement of soldiers preparing for the next push forward. And Eliza felt a relief so profound that her knees buckled and she almost fell, and Marie squeezed her tighter and whispered something in French that sounded like a prayer, and together they walked down the hill toward the checkpoint, where a young private stared at them with an expression of complete disbelief. The documents reached their destination 3 hours late, but they were still in time, and the bombing raid that followed destroyed a German fuel depot that would have supplied tanks during the Battle of the Bulge, and hundreds of American lives were saved because of information that traveled across occupied territory in a leather satchel carried by a black woman that history would try to forget. And Eliza never knew exactly what she had delivered, but she knew from the way her commanders looked at her that it had mattered, and that was enough. But the story of Marie was not over, because Eliza refused to leave her at the camp, and she used every favor she had earned and every connection she had made to ensure that the child was placed with a family in England who would care for her until the war ended, and she visited Marie whenever her duties allowed, and she brought her chocolate and books and small toys that she bought with her own meager pay, and she became the closest thing to a mother that Marie had left, and the bond between them would last long after the guns fell silent. The war continued, and Elisa continued to ride, and she made dozens more deliveries across France and Belgium, and eventually Germany itself, as the Allied forces pushed toward Berlin, and she was shot at twice and nearly captured once. And she survived a motorcycle accident that left her with a scar on her left knee that she would carry for the rest of her life. And through it all, she never complained, and never asked for recognition because she understood that her work had to remain secret and that secrecy was the price of her contribution. The 6,888th Battalion became famous for clearing a backlog of 17 million pieces of mail in 3 months, and the women who served were honored with a unit citation, but Eliza's courier work was never acknowledged because it officially did not exist, and when the war ended she returned to Alabama with nothing but her discharge papers and her memories, and a photograph of Marie that she kept in a locket around her neck. And she told no one about the documents she had carried because she had been ordered never to speak of it, and she was a soldier who followed orders. She came home to a country that was still segregated, and that still treated her as less than human, despite everything she had done, and she could not vote, and could not eat at certain restaurants, and could not use certain restrooms, and she endured these indignities with the same quiet strength that had carried her across Europe. And she married a man named James who had served in the Pacific, and they built a life together in a small house with a garden where Eliza grew tomatoes and roses and never spoke about the war. The years passed and the world changed slowly, and Eliza watched the civil rights movement unfold on her television, and she marched when her body allowed, and she voted when the laws finally changed, and she saw a world that she had helped to save begin to recognize the contributions of people who looked like her, and she felt a quiet satisfaction that she had played a small part in making that recognition possible, even if her own part would never be known. Marie grew up in England and became a teacher, and she never forgot the black American woman who had saved her life in the ruins of a French farmhouse, and she wrote letters to Eliza every month for 50 years. And she visited Alabama 3 times, and each visit they would sit on the porch and drink sweet tea and talk about the old days, and cry and laugh and hold each other's hands, and the bond between them proved that love could survive anything, even war, even distance, even time itself. Eliza May Thornton passed away in 2003 at the age of 82, and she was buried in a small cemetery outside of Tuskegee with a headstone that listed only her name and her dates and the words, "Beloved wife and mother," and there was no mention of her service and no mention of the secrets she had carried and no mention of the lives she had saved, because even in death she kept the promises she had made, and the world she left behind was better for her having lived in it. But history has a way of revealing its secrets. And in 2015, a historian researching the 6,888th Battalion discovered a cache of declassified documents that referenced female couriers operating in the European theater, and among the names mentioned was Eme Thornton, and the fragments of her story began to emerge. And journalists tracked down Marie, who was now an elderly woman living in London, and she told them everything she remembered about the American woman who had carried her through a forest while German patrols hunted nearby. The recognition came too late for Eliza to receive it in person, but her family was invited to Washington, where a senator read her name into the congressional record and called her an unsung hero of the greatest generation, and her grandchildren wept as they listened to words that Eliza herself had never heard, and they wished she could have been there to see that her country had finally acknowledged what she had done, and they knew that somewhere she was watching and that she was proud. Her story reminds us that history is written by those who have the power to write it, and that countless heroes are erased simply because they did not fit the narrative that those in power wanted to tell, and Eliza May Thornton was one of thousands of black women who served during World War II, and whose contributions were minimized or ignored, and her emergence from obscurity is a reminder that we must keep searching for the stories that have been hidden and the names that have been forgotten. The motorcycle she rode is gone, and the documents she carried have crumbled to dust, and the roads she traveled have been paved over and rebuilt, but her courage remains as vivid as the day she climbed onto that motorcycle and kicked the engine to life and rode into uncertainty because her country asked her to, and she did not ask what her country would give her in return. She only asked what she could give, and the answer was everything, and that is what she gave. In Tuskegee today, there is a museum dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots who broke barriers in the skies over Europe, and the museum now includes a small exhibit about the women who served alongside them, and among the photographs and artifacts is a leather satchel that belonged to a courier in a locket, containing a photograph of a French girl, and visitors stop and read the placard and learn about Eliza May Thornton, and many of them cry because her story touches something universal about sacrifice and courage and love. The child she saved became a grandmother. Herself and Marie's children and grandchildren carry the memory of Eliza forward, and they visit her grave when they come to America, and they leave flowers and photographs and letters that thank her for giving their family a future, and the connection between a black woman from Alabama and a white family from England proves that the bonds forged in war can transcend every boundary that humans create, and that love is stronger than hatred, and hope is stronger than despair. And so we remember Elisa May Thornton, not as a footnote in history, but as a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. And we remember her not because she sought glory, but because she sought only to serve. And we remember her because forgetting her would be an injustice that dishonors not just her memory, but the memory of every person who has ever been erased from the story of their own country, and we will not let that injustice stand. The fog still rolls across the French countryside every autumn, and the roads still wind through forests, where the ghosts of soldiers linger. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the sound of a motorcycle engine cutting through the silence, and a woman riding toward a destiny that she chose for herself. Despite every obstacle placed in her path, and Elisa May Thornton lives on in that sound and in that courage and in every woman who refuses to accept that her dreams are too big for the world to hold. She carried secrets across a continent at war, and she carried a child through darkness, and she carried the weight of a nation's prejudice without ever letting it break. Her and the secrets are no longer secret, and the child became a woman who changed lives, and the prejudice is slowly crumbling under the weight of truth. And Elisa May Thornton's legacy is not measured in medals or monuments, but in the simple fact that she made the world better than she found it, and that is the only measure that matters in the end.